Hello to everybody that's joining us just now. We're going to give it a few minutes to let people come into the room, and then we'll get started. Hello, for those just joining us, looks like there's still some people coming in. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes and then we will go ahead and get going. Okay, so I think we'll go ahead and get started then. Thank you for joining us for the third presentation in our History of San Diego webinars. The History Center especially wants to extend a special thank you to our members for all of your support. So if you're interested in the previous two presentations, they are available on the History Center's YouTube channel. I have already put the link in the chat, so it's easy to access. It should be the very first thing, but I will go ahead and post that again once we get going. I have just a couple of things to go over before we start. We will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. Please use the Q&A function. It's down on the bottom to ask your questions. I will be monitoring both chat and the Q&A and answering as I can, and we will present them to Barry at the end. And then this presentation will also be going up on YouTube. It should be up later today if you guys are interested in checking it out. And it is also streaming live now on Facebook. So without any sort of further ado, I'm going to present Barry Goldlust, sorry, Barry, our presenter for the afternoon.
That's okay. I've been called Barry Goldwater and many other things along the way. Thanks, Katie. This is the third in our series of discussions on the development of San Diego. The first two dealt with the prehistory, native life, and the clash with the Spanish as they arrived here to set up a part of their empire. So we're going to talk about how Old Town developed. And yes, it was once San Diego. The difficult part of this presentation, which isn't too difficult, is to how to refer to this area. I'll frequently call it Old Town, obviously, during the period that we'll be discussing. It was just San Diego. And moving forward to the present time, it is now a neighborhood and a state park. And it's very important to understand what the history of San Diego is dealing, especially with the Old Town development. This is our sponsor, San Diego History Center and the Sarah Museum. When we can open up fully, you'll have access to the archives of the history of our region, and anything you want to investigate, this is a good place to start. I am part of the community historian program, and my job is to present information on our history in a way that doesn't put too many people to sleep. So that's my attempt here today to tell you a portion of our history, Old Town, and we're going to talk about the period 1821 to 1872. Now, why these particular dates? Well, this is a slide that you saw in the previous presentation because we've talked about the native peoples and the interaction with the Spanish and the clash of cultures. We're now going to talk about the period mainly involving Mexican and American control, and that period extends from 1821 to 1872. Obviously, the Americans have been here past that date, but that really marks the end of Old Town as the center of our city. The Presidio San Diego was the location originally, starting in 1769, of San Diego called City. And here's a rendition of what it was like around 1790. And of course, the Mexicans did not take control till about 1821 or 22. Around that time, the population in the Presidio was approximately 500 people. And this is where the core of the population that was the form in Old Town came from. Up until 1821, soldiers were not allowed to live down the hill. They had to stay within the Presidio. As early as maybe 1810, they were allowed to plant gardens at the bottom of the hill. And so there was some activity outside the fort, but in terms of dwelling, this did not occur until around 1821. Now, for the most part, the soldiers and their descendants populated Old Town initially. But remember, we were near a harbor, and so there were merchants, there were um, sailors, uh, people of all kinds of backgrounds and occupations, and even occasionally a criminal would come by and move into and sometimes out of town area. So that's kind of the background for how early Old Town was populated. I usually use a population table to give you an idea of the um, uh, what the numbers were, and also a little bit of why they were where they were. In 1769, we're talking about basically uh, native indigenous people. Roughly 20,000 is a wide estimate of the number, but let's use that as a kind of a basis comparison. Then the following numbers for population really reflect non-native numbers. Occasionally there may be natives included. They may have been tax-paying individuals, but for the most part, they were not included in the census, or inaccurately so. So 1834 was when Old Town became a pueblo, that it had enough population to become self-governing. In 1841, you can see quite a large drop comparatively, and that's because people were moving in and out of this area. And so it actually lost Pueblo status and returned to Mexican control. Uh, by the time the Americans arrived, around 1850, see the population was increasing again. Most of the population in the Old Town area, you can see some scattered throughout the county. And then 1860, 1870, there's a jump in population due to the activities that we now refer to as Newtown. We won't talk about Newtown, but this is around the period where Old Town ceases to be the center of San Diego. So one of the reasons for this population moving in and around the area is that um, the soldiers actually, why did they stay around? This is an important point. They could have left the area once the Mexicans took over, but many of them didn't. And the reason was that Mexico couldn't afford to pay for the development of a town. And so they induced uh, the Spanish to come down, and they gave them property or sold for them property for a very low price. So you have all these ranchos, large parcels of land that were virtually given to soldiers and their descendants in the following years of Mexican control. So and it was, and this was, of course, the less expensive way of the Mexicans trying to establish their presence here. This is your earliest photo of Old Town. It's from 1868, and I wanted to point out, you'll see this or parts of this photo several times during the course of uh, this presentation, but if you take a look at what this central square looks like and think about your recent visit to Old Town, uh, it looks familiar. And that's why Old Town's Historic State Park was formed in 1968 to not forget this part of our history. And so some of this will kind of look familiar, even though you've never visited Old Town in the 1800s, but it does, they've done a very nice job of recreating uh, the, uh, the geography and the atmosphere around the central square. A map not meant to be read too closely was surveyed in 1849. And this particular map, uh, uh, kind of the center of it is the square. And a lot of this writing actually was on the original uh, version of the map. And you can see a hypothetical uh, vision of what the plots would be in a well laid out town. And the other thing I wanted to point out is how, in fact, how close the river, San Diego River, was to Old Town. It was indeed very close and often overflowed when there's too much rain. And you can see the orientation. Typical Spanish um, town would have a square that was set up with orientation with the compass points. It's not quite within the compass points, as you can see. It's a bit off, but nevertheless, this was really uh, all Spanish. The Mexicans relied a lot on the Spanish um, way of doing things, if you will. So let's drill down and take a look a little bit more closely at the particular center of the Old Town, the area we're most familiar with, the square. Once the Americans took over, it was known as Washington Square. Prior to that, Plaza de las Armas. And we're going to talk about um, the, uh, the areas represented by these orange circles. They really represent various houses, but each of those houses with the associated families provide interesting stories. So up here we have Presidio Hill. It's a small map of that. And then coming southwest, we get into the area called Old Town. This is a particular star there, Casa de Carrillo. That is probably the first adobe house that was built, and we'll talk more about that. It's across Swan Street near the golf course. And we will stay around the square. We'll visit the Mason Street School a bit and the Casa de Stewart, and also way out of town, which is what the people thought at the time. All of 2 or 3 blocks out from the square was the Whaley House. Really good American era story. So this is what we're going to focus on during the rest of the talk. So we get to the Casa de Carrillo. We have a build date of 1821, depending on what plaques and what references you look at. There are dates as early as 1810, which may be just a little too early. But in fact, this is the first and now the oldest adobe house in the city of San Diego. Here's a picture of it in 1913. Looks like it's in pretty good shape. Don't know what it looks like inside. Here's what it looks like in 2019. Probably looks the same in 2020. And there's a little plaque somewhere here. This now functions as the pro shop for the mini golf course. It's located right across down from Wan Street, right across from the golf course. It's a building that does not distinguish itself very well. If you are interested in history, you have to really search this place out. It's administered by Soho. That organization does not really have any money to support any renovations. Uh, this structure really does need it. So this is the oldest adobe house in the city of San Diego, and nearly the oldest in the county. Who lived here? Well, probably somebody named Carrillo. It wasn't Pedro, and I'll tell you why his picture is here. Um, Joaquin Carrillo was the first Carrillo to live here. He had this house built for him by the Comandante Ruiz from the Presidio. They were good friends, and so the Carrillos came to live here, and Joaquin had 11 children. You'll see this a number in parentheses on many of these slides. That is a reminder to me how many children they had um, in each of these families, because I can't remember that number very easily. It's likely that there weren't uh, 11 children living here at the same time, but nevertheless, it is not a large structure. This structure actually looks quite a bit larger, but nevertheless, that's kind of the history. So this is the Carrillo family. Pedro is the earliest picture of a Carrillo that we have in our collection. He's the grandfather of the actor Leo Carrillo, and they do come from, this family comes from the Spanish aristocracy, and Leo Carrillo would always remind people that his last name was not pronounced Carrillo, but Castilian as Carrillo. And so there was a lot of pride that he showed in his background. So we move on to a little story about one of the Carrillo daughters, Josefa, who this is when these individuals were a little bit more mature, but uh, apparently she was a very stunning young lady when she was 15 or 16, and um, Captain Henry Delano Fitch came to town. He was an American sea captain. He fell in love with Josefa and wanted to marry her, but um, Josefa's father and the governor of the territory, Echeandia, who also had designs on her, were against the marriage. So they eloped and they disappeared for 1 year down to Chile. They got married, they had a child, they returned. And the short story is they made amends, and um, eventually Henry became a citizen, a Mexican citizen. While he was courting Josefa, he did convert to Catholicism, trying to enhance his acceptability as a husband. He was quite a character. His memoirs are available, and you get a really good insight as to uh, what he really thought of people. So uh, one last comment, Henry Fitch actually is the last person who was buried up in the Presidio cemetery, and his coffin was eventually found along with the daughters uh, in the 20th century excavations. Uh, we move on now to a structure that may be the most familiar to anyone who's familiar with this area is the Casa de Estadio, built around 1827. It's at the end of the square. The entrance faces out into the square, and you walk in, and the house is really oriented inward, typical Spanish. About 12 rooms. Um, and this is a current picture. It's been restored uh, to its original design, and it has a little bell tower. And that's a reminder, actually, that uh, many of these buildings um, really had multiple uses. They started out as homes, but they became or partially became things like restaurants, uh, churches, courthouses, um, uh, granaries, all different kinds of uses were made of these homes. And so as we go along, you'll notice that I'll be making comments along that line, but that was very typical of what was happening. The first Estudio, Don Jose Antonio, this is a portrait of him, was involved in the building of the CASA. This is what the CASA looked like in 1890, pretty dilapidated. And it was renovated. It was renovated in the early 1900s. Property was actually bought by John Spreckles. John Spreckles worked with Hazelwood Waterman, first female architect in San Diego, to renovate this place. And it became known until the 1960s as Ramona's Marriage Place. Ramona, from the title of the book by Helen Hunt Jackson about life in this area and the relationships between the natives and non-natives. Um, and people would flock to this place. Interesting enough, John was a really clever guy. He was responsible for amalgamating the city's electrical transit lines, and there was a stop quite near this place so that people from other areas of the city could visit. So that was he made it very convenient for everyone. I should go back a bit. The Casa Estudio, in addition to being a church, also played a role in protecting some of the locals from the Americans. When the Americans took over, it wasn't clear what the level of safety was, and so this was a refuge at that point. So this is Casa de Estudio, renovated and well known. Bandini. I have to start with the family. Juan Bandini came from a family whose ancestor was Italian. Juan Bandini himself was born in Lima, Peru. He had 2 wives, 5 children by each wife, and had this Casa di Bandini built once again before 1830. There's no picture of the original casa. It was 1 story, and eventually it became the Cosmopolitan Hotel. This adobe building, Albert Sealy attached an upper level to it, became the Cosmopolitan Hotel in 1872. Bears the same name now, although it was renovated again, of course, in the 2000s. And as is the case with some other buildings in Old Town. It's purported to have ghosts. I'll leave it there. You can go on a ghost trip, tourist trip if you wish. Um, they apparently have lighting problems, so the lights flicker every once in a while as well. And you can decide for yourself. The other thing about this picture is this big, tall, what is used as a flag pole, but really it's not. It's a mast from an old ship that was placed here previously. So this CASA di Bandini Cosmopolitan Hotel is just off the square across from the Casa Estadio. And the thing about the Bandinis, they say that where the Bandinis go, revolution follows. They never miss an opportunity to join a rebellion. And in fact, he was involved in actually capturing the Presidio and taking 2 officers prisoner. Um, he was responsible for having one of the territorial governors removed from office, and he is known as the destroyer of the California missions because of his support for the secularization. Probably can go on and on and on, but uh, that's the Bandini family. They are still in this area. We now talk a little bit about 2 Americans, but actually in the 1830s, the 2 men, Richard Freeman and Alan Light, both Black men. It's not clear about Freeman's background, whether he was an escaped slave or not, but Alan Light was in fact a free Black from Philadelphia and carried papers with him to prove that to anyone who needed to have that information. They lived in a house which was eventually called the San Diego house. The location is right here. So this is that 1868 picture. So you see that this is a 2-story building. This is the restoration of the Freeman Light building. You can see it's only 1 level, which is what it was originally. This is a picture of what that house was after it was torn down, rebuilt as a 2 level place identified as the American Hotel. American Hotel. And the models that you can see in the information booth will have this particular house rather than the original San Diego house. They use it as a saloon as well as living quarters, and I think now it's a spice shop. Yes. So this is where it was located. And interestingly, as I thought about my comment of not having seen a picture of the Cosmopolitan Hotel as a single story, this particular area, and I'm going to have to check with other historians about this, but this looks like a single level home, and in fact may very well be the Cosmopolitan or the Casa Bandini before the 2nd level was put on. So hold that thought. We'll do a little bit more investigation. Here's a picture of the Alan Light's papers dated November 27th, 1827. And his protection papers. There was also another paper about some of his personal information. These papers were found many years later in the wall of one of the buildings not very far from where the San Diego house was located. It's not known why those papers were stored there. Now we go to another family, the Machado family. Um, Machado, Jose Miguel, I believe, was uh, one of the uh, leather jacket soldiers. Leather jacket soldiers were um, uh, horseback soldiers. They wore a jacket that had about 5 or 6 layers of cowhide, and that was thick enough to uh, uh, prevent penetration of arrows uh, uh, to them, and was their armor, so to speak. And so um, uh, that family did populate Old Town, and Jose Manuel Machado was the first. He built 2 homes. This was the first of the 2 homes. It's called the Machado Stewart home because one of his daughters did marry a John Stewart. John Stewart had a kind of an interesting uh, uh, bit of history. Uh, he sailed on the same boat as Richard Henry Dana, who wrote 2 years before the mast. Dana, of course, spent a year in the Playa area of the bay and working in hide houses, and he did write about that. So Stewart was a companion of sorts with Dana, and he married uh, Rosa Machado, and this is a restoration, adobe restoration. This is a really nice house. It gives you a really good flavor for how these homes were built. There's a Carrizo cane ceiling, and it's just a very nice building to give you an idea of what life was like. They had a very nice garden which was recreated, um, vegetables, fruits, and some cactus plants, and they sold these. They used them for the family, and the Machado Stewart family occupied this residence for 130 years up until the 1960s. And the Machado family is certainly living in the area. I don't know the history of the Stewart family. If anybody has that information, I'd be interested in knowing that. So this was one of the Machado homes. The second Machado home built by Jose Manuel was Machado SILVAS home. And here in that famous 1868 picture is where it was located. Remember, this was a San Diego house that became a hotel. And we didn't talk about this house, but this is the Machado SILVAS house. It was built in the shape of an L. This is the restoration today, is a restaurant. And in fact, this multi-purpose house, like most of the houses, was turned partly into a restaurant by the wife who I believe was maybe in the process of a divorce. Husband left for a while, and when he returned, there was a restaurant. And so that is how it's portrayed now, the Machado SILVAS restaurant. Um, this is the building in 1900, and there's something peculiar that may not be apparent uh, to a lot of people. It kind of sits alone. And my suspicion is that, in fact, the buildings around it were actually destroyed during that famous fire in 1872. We'll come back to that in a moment. It looks also as if it may have been somewhat restored even at this point. Uh, so Machado, there were four Machado daughters, and that's a wonderful history in itself. Uh, I, I have limited information on it, but I do know that they all owned property. They all married Anglos. They all were held in esteem in a socioeconomic environment that really um, wasn't female oriented. So they managed to push the envelope to the extreme, considering the times that they lived in. Uh, Now we kind of switch ears. So we'll talk a bit about uh, the Americans and when they came to uh, uh, Old Town. Uh, this is the other end of from the Estadio, Casa Estadio. Uh, looks familiar to probably a lot of people. This is the information building, which was, currently it's a rebuilt version. This had to be rebuilt, but this was known as the Robinson Rose House, built in 1853. Now the information uh, office for Old Town. Robinson and Rose, these two fellows came to Old Town overland. They came from Texas, I believe it was El Paso, on a wagon train, um, and their backgrounds were quite different. Um, Lewis Rose was the first Jewish person to live in Old Town. He was born in Germany, had a thick uh, uh, accent when he spoke English, came to the eastern United States, lived in several cities, including New Orleans, then had been married or was married. And then he went to Texas because business wasn't particularly good in New Orleans. Left his wife behind and I guess failed to tell her that he was going to California. And so they became estranged and eventually divorced. He hooked up with James Robinson, who was a lawyer and also um, a, a temporary governor of the Texas territory. So the story of how they came here overland is described as basically they walked most of the way. The wagons and the wagon train carried the people who couldn't walk, furniture, food, and those able-bodied people were given the pleasure of walking from Texas to California. Probably took about 3 months and was a, a feature of part of our Jewish exhibit 2 or 3 years ago. Um, Lewis Rose in particular was a very interesting character, and he was an entrepreneur. He was into all kinds of businesses. He owned a tannery. He was he held a mine. He was the first postmaster of San Diego. He invested in land, but interestingly, not in Old Town, but in an area that we now know as Roseville, in the Point Loma area. He is also the namesake of the Rose Canyon, which was meant to be a stopover area for people going from San Diego to Los Angeles. And he was also an inventor of sorts. One of his inventions for sure didn't go over very well. He manufactured a mattress that was filled with seaweed, only didn't really figure out how to deal with the aroma of seaweed. So that was a very good invention. But he is also involved in the Jewish life locally, and was eventually a trustee in the early years of the American control around 1853, I believe. Very interesting fellow. And he and James Robinson were good business pals for the duration. Once Robinson passed away, um, Lewis Rose bought this house. Another Jewish man came from San Francisco. His name was Louis Franklin. Lewis arrived about 1851. And that big old structure that we had been seeing and I hadn't really commented on, wood framed 3-story house became a hotel called the Franklin House Hotel. And was the only or first 3-story building in San Diego. And Lewis was a pretty outspoken individual. He was the jury foreman, grand jury foreman, and made it well known to other officials that he thought that Old Town was lawless and not run very well, and he didn't really make a lot of friends. He was also one of the trustees along with Lewis Rose. So they were 2 of the 3 trustees when the city went into default, and they basically ran the city, making financial decisions for San Diego. He was influential in bringing Thomas Whaley, who we'll talk about later, to Old Town. And speaking of Thomas Whaley, another name that's probably well known amongst San Diegans, the Whaley House, built around 1857, was the first 2-story brick house built and was considered to be a wonderful example of fine living. It had a granary on the side, and had many uses. It was this area eventually became a general store. The upstairs became a theater, if for only about 3 months. Professional theater, a Tanner. His name was the Tanner Group. It housed the county records, and it was at some point the courthouse as well. And you wondered where he lived. Now, this is considered to be the most haunted house in the United States. And I can't tell you why, except that people who have visited the Whaley House have seen a young child apparition. I've heard the noise of the steps of a man who they believe might have been Thomas Whaley, of a criminal who was hung from the back of a on this property called Yankee Jim Robinson. So a lot of things are going on in this house. Once again, go on that ghost tour if you want to know more about it. This is a picture of Thomas and his wife Anna and two of his 6 children in 1858. Now, he built the house in 1857. They left because business wasn't very good, and they went to San Francisco. And he stayed there for a while and came back. By that time, he had his family of 6, I believe, or most of the kids were born. And he left San Francisco because of an earthquake. And so that kind of settled his mind on, I think I'll stay in San Diego. And then he got involved in the businesses I discussed, and was a well-known individual. And I think the house also had its own water supply, but I'm not absolutely certain of that. And his brother, he eventually moved to Newtown, but his brother Frank, um, or his son Frank, who played the guitar, came back to live at this home and would entertain tourists with his playing and conversation. Mason Street School, you've probably seen this building. This is a reconstruction. The only thing of the original Mason Street School is are the floors, and I think something maybe near the roof as well. It was built in 1865, and it was the first public school for the county of San Diego. And Mary Chase Walker, who came down from San Francisco, was the first school teacher at the Mason School. They had about 42 children on record. It serviced San Diego County, which was much larger than it is right now. In fact, an area larger than the states of Massachusetts and Connecticut combined. It's about 15,000 square miles. One school teacher, one room schoolhouse. Eventually, the Mason Street School was moved to another location along Taylor Street. It was a 2-story building, which I guess is no longer there. And then eventually the Mason Street School was rebuilt. A story about Mary Chase Walker is kind of interesting. She came down from San Francisco, was very sick on the boat, and was tended to by a black woman. Well, they met up again in San Diego, and Marianne and this woman dined out together and caused a major stir, and led to really ultimatum. Either she leaves the school or she gets fired. And you have to understand this bias in terms of the population of blacks around this time. There were probably less than a handful of black individuals who were actually registered in the census. Maybe there were some more that weren't registered, but not a lot of black individuals, yet the bias was so strong that it caused a major change in the life of this woman. She did not leave town. She actually married Ifra Morse, a well-known, prominent businessman in town. We will not talk about this man. His name is Alonzo Horton. He is the subject of our next presentation on Newtown. but he was almost single-handedly responsible for the end of Old Town as a center of San Diego. This is a quote from Albert Seeley, who eventually bought the Bandini Casa and put that second story on, built that hotel, and he remembered that early failed attempt in 1850 by another individual, William Heath Davis, um, to uh, build a new town. And he said, that'll never happen, and this guy won't be successful either. Um, Unfortunately for him and his business and the people in Old Town, uh, Alonzo Horton was quite successful. And two last events that kind of rung the death knell for Old Town as a center of San Diego. The moving of the county records from the Whaley House, a lot of urban legends around this story, but um, basically the records were had to be taken by a posse sent out from Newtown to recover the records, and they brought them to temporary quarters in Newtown area while the new courthouse was being built. And subsequently the records were moved to the new county courthouse. And finally, that major fire that if you read records, read reviews, not really historic documents about the fire, you'd think that um, every building in um, Old Town was actually destroyed. In fact, that wasn't the case. Only about a quarter of the square was destroyed. And it was the area that we were talking about. Remember that three-story house by the Franklin house? That was completely burned down. Part of the Machado house probably was destroyed, but not entirely. And some of the other houses, the along that road were destroyed, and that was really where most of the damage was. The Estudio Casa had some damage done to it. And they believe that because of its tiled roof, it may have prevented the fire from spreading down in that direction towards the Cosmopolitan Hotel. But there was enough damage because there are quite a few businesses located in the buildings that were destroyed that really impacted the longevity and the viability of Old Town. And by this point, the population was several thousand in Newtown, about 2,000 or 3,000, and that's really where the future of San Diego would be. And the end of Old Town um, as a center of San Diego. So that is kind of the story of Old Town. Hopefully we all appreciate the fact that in 1968, with the help of State Senator James Mills, the historic park was founded, and it is really an excellent representative of what the town was really like back in the day. And the other thing is when we return to normalcy, if you have the opportunity to visit Old Town and want to make the most of it from a historical standpoint, uh, do visit the McCoy House, which is located just behind the uh, the information house, the Robinson Rose house, and also the Robinson Rose information area. They have displays which are really quite nice and give you a lot more information than I've been able to give you during this presentation. So I hope you've been able to learn a few different things about Old Town and maybe see it differently on your next visit. And thank you for listening out there, and appreciate your attendance.
Awesome. Thank you, Barry. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We do have a couple of questions in the queue, so we'll just go ahead and get started. From Jonathan Schulman, the photograph that you referenced in your presentation shows that all of Old Town, shows how close the coast was to Old Town at the time. At some point, could you speak to where the port was for Old Town, where the old coastline would be today, and when and why the coastline was expanded to where it was today?
It wasn't so much the coastline. We were talking about the river. So the river ran very close to where the town itself was located, and did empty into the bay. Eventually down, oh, I don't know how to exactly explain it, probably north of where the airport is right now. I think that's where it was. The river would change courses over the decades, and so sometimes it would empty into the bay, and sometimes it would empty into Mission Bay. And it was only around the 1940s, early 50s when that canal was built to funnel the river out into the ocean. I hope that answers at least part of that question.
And I can actually answer a little bit of that question as well.
Okay.
We have Sanborn maps in our collection, which are fire insurance maps, and they show change over time. So the original map is made, and then there are edits made to the original map. And ours run, generally speaking, from 1921 to 1955. And they show the progression of the expansion of the coastline. So you see it like growing out in the copy paste edits. So it was still, as of even the 50s, as late as the 50s, they were still expanding the coastline there. So hopefully we answered your question a little bit there. The next question is from Marilyn. What is the real reason that the Delaware Corporation was awarded the Old Town concession, which of course turned out to be a failure? And then she relates that she spent many delightful hours in Diane Power's Old Town.
Right. I'm sorry, I cannot answer that. I don't have information on that.
I'm afraid I don't really know anything about that either. I'm very sorry, Marilyn.
I would say that I was rather new to the area when Old Town was converted, and it didn't make sense to me at that point when I didn't know a whole lot about the history of the area. And in retrospect, it was just it would have just not been a good thing to do, but it was done, and it represented nothing about the history of our area. That would have been tragedy had it stayed that way.
Our next question comes from Mark Thompson. It says, Barry mentioned that the Carrillo house was built for them by Ruiz, who was the mayor at some point. Did a person need any type of permission to build a house in Old Town, or could they just show up and do it?
Well, my understanding is that the land was obtained from the Mexican government, and until there was self-rule, until the pueblo was formed, I guess some sort of permission had to be given for people to have property and build on it. It was the property around the square was prime area, so only those families that had you know, that had a substantial history, a reputation, money, whatever, uh, really were given permission to build around that area.
All right. Our next question comes from Jane Singer. And she wanted to know, Barry, if you knew the name William A. Winder, who was a longtime San Diego resident, formerly an artillery captain at Alcatraz, and the lone son of the infamous John H. Winder, planned to serve the Union during the Civil War.
I have no information. The only reason why that name is familiar to me is that on the concrete blocks that you will see in various neighborhoods, where they have the date that the sidewalks were put in, there is a one construction company with the name Winder, and I don't know if that has anything to do with his family.
If people are interested in knowing a little bit more about William Winder, Ms. Singer did write a book called The War Criminal's Son that talks about his history in San Diego and his life in San Diego. So if someone out there does want to do a little bit more research, I suggest that, checking out that book. The next question is from Marie. She was looking for articles or resources that speak to the history of Franklin and Rose being trustees who helped San Diego when the city defaulted and had no funds.
I would have to hunt those up. I wouldn't have them offhand. I'm sure there are some references, especially city documents for that time. That was pretty early in the history of the city, 1850s, when the trusteeship went into effect. But if you wish to have some references, we could try and search some up for you.
And Maria, I sent you my email address if you were interested in communicating further about that.
Okay.
The next question comes from Robert Scott. Can you talk about the Victorian wooden kit houses carried here by ship from Boston?
Well, focusing on Old Town, I can give you one story. It was part of the presentation, but it would have extended the presentation too long. But there's a house referred to as the Derby Pendleton House. This was one of the prefab houses that William Heath Davis had ordered from New England. And it was actually built in Newtown and then transferred to Old Town. And for the life of me, I don't know the story behind that. It seems like an awful lot of work to build that house one place and move it to another area. But that building is still standing. It's located just behind the Whaley House, and it's the headquarters for Soho. And it's obviously been renovated, but it was one of those prefab houses. In fact, I believe that the house that's the old San Diego Union newspaper house may be another one of those prefab houses. Katie, do you recall that at all?
That does sound kind of familiar. I wouldn't
Yeah.
want to say 100% that yes, that is absolutely true, but I think you're correct.
Okay, yeah, that's where my brain is that I kind of read that as well. And the I guess the Heath, the Davis house that's located on Island and Fourth, I believe is one of the original houses in Newtown, although I don't know if it's one of the prefab houses.
That's kind of interesting that they're still around. The next question comes from Linda J. What year was the major fire?
It was 1872.
Mike V has the next question. Where was the original San Antonio, San Diego mail station located?
I don't know. uh, I really don't know. I believe that when Rose was a postmaster, his home was um, basically the post office. Um, one of the things that a post office needs to have is an address, and he had an address, and that was an advantage. So that may very well be um, uh, a uh, the location of that, but I don't know for sure.
This is also just pure speculation on my part, but I believe there was a stage station at the Cosmopolitan Hotel, correct? So it's entirely possible that that could have been at least a stop or possibly the terminal stop for a mail stage. The next question is from Marie again. May you please speak about the leadership of Old San Diego, the history of its governance?
We may run out of Zoom time, and it's not something that I'm really familiar with, but I do know in general, the early government, uh, uh, when the Americans took over, it posed a problem for the Mexican, the Spanish people who were living in Old Town. They basically they weren't all pro-American. They didn't all participate in politics. There was a language barrier, so they it was difficult to know um, who was doing what in a sense. There was a requirement for a representative from the territory before the Americans took over to the Mexican legislature. Once the Americans took over, that's when the Spanish and Mexican individuals kind of lost a lot of uh, or did not participate as much in local politics. They were actually quite overwhelmed by the sheer number of Anglos that started moving into the area. So it was that was a difficult time for the Spanish and Mexicans.
Uh, the next question comes from Jean S. The name of the gentleman that secularized Old Town and tried to do away with the missions.
Oh, Juan Bandini.
Thank you. Kathleen D has the next question. It was my understanding that the stage to Julian stopped at the Cosmopolitan Hotel during their gold rush in 1870, but your photographs seem to date the hotel at 1872. Is that just the photo's date, or are you saying it wasn't converted to the hotel until 1872?
Repeat that again. I didn't catch the first date.
So I guess the photo that you used showing the Cosmopolitan Hotel was dated to 1872. And Kathleen was wondering, it was her understanding that the stage to Julian stopped at the Cosmopolitan during their gold rush in 1870. So she was wondering if the 1872 date was just the photos date, or if you were saying it wasn't converted to a hotel until 1872.
You know, I don't really know the relationship between the stage and Julian. That was around the time that that mini gold rush was occurring. I don't know the logistics.
There is some information on our website, www.sandiegohistory.org, under the research tab about stage lines and mail routes. So that might be a place to start, because I can see there's some discussion going back and forth about the mail routes and the stage coaches and when and where everything was. So that might be a place that people who want to dig in a little bit deeper can kind of get started from there. So Robert has another question. How is Old Town being integrated into the city's long-range community plan for that area? That
I really can't address that.
Yeah, we're not normally privy to the city's plans. They kind of just do stuff and we're like, okay, and kind of roll with it. Let's see. There's another question from Maryland asking whether Horton might have been behind the fire.
I've not heard that legend at all. I would be really surprised, because even without the fire, there was enough transition of businesses from Old Town to New Town by that point that it seemed inevitable that New Town would take over as the important central location for the city. But like I said, I haven't heard that suggestion.
It definitely did him some good, though, which is all I will say about that. It looks like our last question is going to be from Ruben D. He asks you to comment briefly on the Aguirre House, Aguirre, and also if you had any information about the Indian uprising and capture of Indian servants by Lieutenant Macedonio Gonzalez.
No, the latter, I don't have any information. Aguirre, I'm aware of the family, but I don't have the specifics to be able to answer your question.
And one last question from Marie. Where was Newtown, and did Newtown eventually evolve into today's downtown?
Where did it originally start?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, then I'll have to give you my next talk. But essentially, the property that Alonzo Horton bought up was about 900 acres, and it extended from the bay, the coast of the bay, all the way up on the west side of. It probably included Bankers Hill, all the way up to the border of Hillcrest. So it was 900 acres on the west side of the park, where the park is now, and all the way down to the bay. So the center city, as we know it right now, is really the center of where Newtown started.
So, and that kind of leads neatly into our next presentation, which is going to be taking place on November 10th, second Tuesday of next month. I believe that is all the time that we're going to have today. However, so please look out for the next presentation, November 10th, as I said, and visit our website, www.sandiegohistory.org, for any more information, or if you wanted to do some research, or if you'd like to help support the History Center with the donation. That would be about it. Thank you very much, Barry, and thanks everybody for joining us today.
Thank you.
Have a good day.